For most of his life in front of the camera, Al Roker had mastered the art of brightness, the easy grin that greeted millions each morning on Today, the reassuring cadence that could pivot from sunshine forecasts to storm warnings without missing a beat. Yet, as he moved deeper into his 60s, he began to understand a quieter, more complicated truth about his work, that the very vulnerability he once tried to shield from the public had become the bridge that allowed viewers to trust him in moments of national uncertainty. It was a realization shaped not only by decades of covering hurricanes, blizzards, and national tragedies, but by personal seasons of fear and recovery, health scares that forced him off the set, long nights in hospital rooms where the glow of studio lights was replaced by the soft hum of medical machines. And in those moments, sitting beside his wife, Deborah Roberts, herself a seasoned correspondent at ABC News, he felt the paradox most sharply. How could a man tasked with projecting steadiness allow his own grief and frailty to be seen without unsettling the very audience that relied on him? Deborah, who had reported from war zones and disaster sites with composure that masked her own emotional toll, understood the tension instinctively. And during one particularly difficult winter, when Al was recovering from surgery and the nation was grappling with a series of devastating natural disasters, she told him that the strength viewers sought was not the absence of struggle, but the evidence of survival. Her words lingered with him when he returned to the studio, thinner, slower perhaps, but unmistakably present. And when he spoke that first morning about gratitude, about the nurses who had cared for him, and the viewers who had written letters by the thousands, his voice carried a tremor that could not be scripted, and instead of diminishing him, it seemed to draw the country closer. For those in their early 60s, watching from kitchen tables and recliners, many facing their own diagnoses or caring for spouses, there was comfort in seeing a familiar face acknowledge fear without surrendering to it. Al began to weave small fragments of his own journey into coverage of high-stakes breaking news, not to center himself, but to illuminate the human dimension beneath statistics, recalling, during hurricane coverage, the vulnerability he felt lying in a hospital bed while storms raged outside, or gently reminding viewers during segments on healthcare policy that behind every headline were families negotiating uncertainty one appointment at a time. This was the vulnerability paradox he came to embody, that personal grief, when offered with humility, could humanize even the most overwhelming events. Deborah watched the shift with admiration, noticing how her husband's storytelling had grown quieter but deeper, less about spectacle and more about solace. And in the evenings, over simple dinners at home, they would reflect on how aging had recalibrated their ambitions, how awards and ratings had given way to a longing for meaning, for impact measured in handwritten notes from retirees who felt seen rather than in viral clips. There were still days when the weight pressed heavily, when covering mass tragedies or interviewing families who had lost everything, Al would feel the familiar tightening in his chest, the urge to retreat behind professional distance. But he had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that suppressing emotion extracted its own cost, and so he practiced a different discipline, allowing himself to feel, to pause, to acknowledge the ache before stepping back into the frame. He often thought about peers like David Muir, whose steady reporting on ABC World News Tonight demonstrated that empathy and authority were not mutually exclusive, and he took quiet courage from the knowledge that audiences were evolving too, increasingly receptive to authenticity over bravado. For viewers in the 60 to 65 age range, many of whom had spent lifetimes cultivating resilience in silence, Al's openness felt like permission, a reminder that the later chapters of life need not be defined by stoicism alone, but could be enriched by candor. One spring afternoon, after delivering a particularly emotional segment about a community rebuilding after catastrophic flooding, Al returned home and found Deborah tending to their garden, her hands deep in soil, and he joined her without speaking, both understanding that the work of restoration, whether of towns or spirits, required patience. "Do you ever worry we're showing too much?" he asked, finally, voicing a concern that had shadowed him since his return to television. And Deborah smiled gently, brushing dirt from her palms, and said, "We're showing what's real, and real is what lasts." In that simple exchange, Al felt the paradox resolve itself not as a contradiction, but as a calling to use the credibility earned over decades not as armor, but as an invitation, to stand before the nation not as an unshakable figure, but as a fellow traveler who had known fear and found footing again. As he continued to report on breaking news, on storms intensifying with climate change, on communities grappling with loss, on families facing uncertain futures, he carried with him the memory of hospital corridors and the steady presence of the woman who had walked beside him through them, and that memory tempered his delivery with compassion. For those watching who were themselves navigating retirement, illness, or the quiet griefs that accumulate with time, Al's journey offered a subtle but powerful reassurance that vulnerability does not erode authority, but deepens it, that sharing sorrow can transform isolation into solidarity, and that in the twilight years of a long career, the most profound service a broadcaster can offer is not flawless composure, but honest humanity, a willingness to say, in word and tone alike, that even amid high-stakes headlines and relentless news cycles, our shared fragility is what binds us, steadies us, and ultimately carries us forward.